suppose we're all guilty of having these incentives to some degree, but I do think it's a relevant detail that the former defense secretary admitted this. And by the way, Netanyahu's admitted this, Ehud Barak has admitted this.
They admitted that they allowed funds to go from Qatar to Hamas because Hamas was governing the Gaza.
For the reason of preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state.
No, that was not the case.
That is what Netanyahu said. That is what Ehud Barak said. It's all
There's
up and down.
One claim. There's one recording of Netanyahu saying something like that. But look, I mean, we should get on. We should get onto it.
I could read you the quotes from Ehud Barak as well.
No, I know.
It's all of them have talked about it.
The situation. Let's get onto it. The situation there, and the war of the last 18 months now, more than 18 months. Is a result not of that, but of Hamas deciding to start another war with Israel and trying to murder their neighbor.
But you don't think if they were being propped up by Israel, that has nothing to do with
they were
the
not
group?
being propped up by Israel. The reason why Hamas were in power, as you know, much against the interests of the Israelis, was that they were voted into power after the Israelis withdrew from Gaza in 2005. Condoleezza Rice and other American statesfolk insisted Palestinians should have elections straight after the Israeli withdrawal. They had elections, perhaps unwisely, and Hamas won, and then didn't have another election again, and ruled the Gaza for 18 years until they finally got the great fruit of their labors on the 7th of October 2023, and went around southern Israel massacring everyone they could, including young people at a dance party. And the whole thing is a great tragedy, and all of it is at the feet of Hamas.
I certainly agree with you that it's a great tragedy, and I do, I think it's when you accuse me of using the quotes that kind of back up what I believe, I think it's very convenient here to remove all responsibility from the Israelis. Like, even if I'm telling you that you have these quotes, I mean, I'm not talking about fringe figures. We could read through the list of people who have admitted what the strategy was with them funding Hamas and propping them up. But hold on, let me just say, so if you're going to tell me Israel props up this terrorist organization in order to kill the peace process, in order to make sure that the international community gives them a no one. By the way, Smotrich, right, the finance minister, okay, he's on record saying, look, Hamas is an asset. The Palestinian Authority, they're the liability. Hamas is an asset because we can tell the international community, well, look, what do you want us to do? There's a terrorist organization here. We can't do business with them. And then even Ehud Barak admitted, like, this was also so that liberal Israelis, if it was the Palestinian Authority, they'd be like, hey, we should make a deal with them, but since it's Hamas, they can't. Okay, so if Israel props up this terrorist organization, and then as a response to them committing a horrific act of terrorism, decides to level the entire place and just slaughter women and children in large numbers.
It didn't decide to do that, and it didn't do that. But,
It didn't level the place. Gaza's not
Gaza
destroyed.
is pretty leveled by now.
Yeah.
They did not go in to level the place like that, no.
Okay, they went in and leveled the place, but that wasn't their intention?
Let's just go back to the beginning if we can.
Sure.
Because it's important. Since you're interested in the question of the Palestinian state, the Palestinians were given another state in 2005 when every single Jew was removed from Gaza by the IDF, and when even the graves of Israelis in Gaza were dug up and taken into the rest of Israel. Of all of the what-ifs of Palestinian Arab history, the era since 2005 should be one of the great what-ifs, which is, what if the American taxpayers' money that was poured into Gaza, European Union taxpayer money that was poured into Gaza, had been used by a government in Gaza to build a state that lived side by side with their Israeli neighbors and flourished. And it's not like the money wasn't there, it's not like there wasn't the international will. Ismail Haniyeh and the other leaders of Hamas used that money, as you know, to make themselves billionaires and to buy themselves and their kids condos in Qatar, to live extremely well, whilst withholding the money from the Palestinian people, whilst building their network of tunnels throughout Gaza, and building an infrastructure of terror. And that's what they did with 18 years in Gaza. And of all of the what ifs, just consider that that one was in their hands. The Israelis did not make them vote in Hamas. The Israelis would not want a terrorist entity that wants to annihilate the state of Israel, that is there on their doorstep, constantly firing rockets, starting wars every few years. Why would the Israelis want a group there that means that if you're living in towns like Sderot or Ashkelon or Ashdod, your children grow up all the time knowing that they might have to go to the bomb shelters, and that's during peacetime.
Well, according to them, the reason they want it there is because then it kills the peace process, and then you have a no one to negotiate with certificate, and that then you can keep your eyes on building up settlements in the West Bank.
There are, as now, many people to negotiate with. Mahmoud Abbas may be, I don't know as the joke goes, currently in something like his 20th year of his first 4-year term as head of the Palestinian Authority. But Mahmoud Abbas is there in Ramallah. The compounds of the Palestinian Authority, which I've been to many times in Ramallah, are there. They run their portions of the West Bank. They could be there to negotiate with at any moment. The Israelis have said they want to negotiate with them at any moment and come to the deal. In fact, Netanyahu, you're so fond of quoting, said again before this war began that he would come to the table with no red lines to begin with to start another negotiation with the Palestinian Authority. But let's just get back to this thing, because this is so crucial. I am so startled by the post-October the 7th world, not just in Israel and Gaza and everywhere where I've spent most of the last 18 months, but in what's happening here in the United States of America. It blows my mind, the desire to leap over the first victims of this and go on to all of the proximate causes, theoretical causes, what ifs, and so on. I was, as I described in the opening of this book, I was in New York on the 7th of October, and I woke up and started seeing what was happening, and discovered that later that day already there were plans to organize a protest in Times Square, and not believed. The era we lived through in the late 2010s was the era of the national community does not want to listen to them at all, and certainly doesn't want to believe them. And there are many reasons. One, at the most fundamental level, is that I think a part of a generation that's coming up has been told there is some. I think, in addition, it plays to some of the darkest things of the regional mind as well as the international mind. The aims of Hamas, their stated aims, include the annihilation of the Jewish people. And October the 7th, they had their best go at doing that. And the fact that in a decision between whether or not you're on the side of the people who want to dance and live in peace with their neighbors, or whether you're on the side of the people who want to rampage through a dance party bar in the early morning, macheteing at people, I find it amazing that there are so many people who don't know which side they're on. But there are a lot of them. There are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the foremost reasons is the fact that the state of Israel has been uniquely libeled, has been uniquely lied about. Its history has been uniquely lied about. It has been uniquely put under an international spotlight and then misrepresented in a way which I cannot think of many other countries in the world that have been treated that way.
Of course,
and there are deep reasons for it and shallow reasons for it. The deep reasons include some of the most ancient bigotries of the human heart, and the shallow reasons are people who don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Okay, I think that look, I'm not going to speak for what every person out there believes. I don't exactly agree with the characterization that there was no outpouring of feeling after October 7th, and certainly everybody I know was just oh my god, this is a horrific atrocity, and an unprecedented terrorist attack from Hamas, the worst terrorist attack in Israeli history against Israelis. And it was horrible. I think what a lot of I'm not arguing that there are no people who are actually pro-Hamas, or there are no people who are actually like hate Jews or something like that. I do think that what happens is that a lot of people get put in that category who do not belong there. Much like we've seen this over the last year and a half, where a lot of people, you have John Podhoretz calling Thomas Massey anti-Semitic scum because he said, we're dead broke. We can't afford to fund everybody else's war here. People have been calling Tucker Carlson anti-Semitic all over the place. But these are two guys, Thomas Massey and Tucker Carlson, who have never uttered the words "the Jews" in their life. Like they're just not anti-Semites at all. So there's a lot of people, I think, who are when they're critical of the Israeli government's response to this, get lumped in as pro-Hamas. I will certainly say that's certainly not my position. I think your description of them, death cult, by the way, the same term that Daryl Cooper used to describe Hamas, I think is an accurate one. And it was horrible. But I think that I think that your characterization, first of all, of that an accurate way to describe the disengagement, which we could get into more if you want to. But first of all, I would just point out that if the two-state solution was achieved, I assume you're arguing it was taken away after that. You're not still arguing that the Palestinians have a state, or are you saying they have had a state since 2005?
They were given a state in the Gaza.
And when was it taken away?
Well, they kind of screwed it up for themselves on the 7th of October.
So you're saying from 2005 all the way till October 7th, there was a two-state solution. It had been achieved.
Well, it was another state, yeah.
Oh, okay, but that would be two states then.
No, it was another state. It was different from the PA.
Okay, right, but I'm saying a Palestinian state.
Yeah. Okay,
so what's interesting about that is that this is not how any of the leaders really describe it. I mean, when Netanyahu himself is not claiming that they had already achieved a two-state solution, why are you talking about this? What happened in 2005 in the disengagement was that essentially Israel went from occupying the place to surrounding the place. And they've had it under a brutal blockade since 2007. And yes, you were right that it was...
Why do you... I don't agree the blockade was brutal by any means.
You don't think the blockade of Gaza was brutal?
I mean, how brutal do you think the Egyptians are?
Pretty brutal.
Right.
Yeah.
They allowed stuff in.
Okay. I mean, since some stuff has gotten in, yes, that's true.
More than some stuff.
Okay.
More than some stuff.
Okay. I'll say this, right? Because there's been different levels of blockade, even before 2007, going back. I know in 1930 strong blockade that year, according to the World Bank, it referenced the Great Depression was a 30% contraction. This was in 1996. For 1 year, they gave them something worse than our Great Depression. That was just 1 year. From 2007 on, there's been a blockade of that country. You don't think that's kept the country poor?
Why do you think there's a blockade of any kind?
Why is there a blockade? Well, I mean, the argument from Israel would be...
No, why do you think?
I would say, okay, I think that the disengagement, I think Smotrich was correct when he said that, I'm sorry, my mistake there. I think which another quote that I'm sure you're familiar with, but Dov Weissglaff, who was the senior advisor to Sharon, was the prime minister at the time. He essentially said the reason we're doing the disengagement, the reason we're doing this is so that we can put the peace process in formaldehyde. This is the reason we're doing it.
You're not answering my question. You're
yes,
continuing to cite
I'm getting
very right-wing Israeli politicians. But what do you think?
I'm getting blockade around the country for the reason that they've always kind of done it there, that, yeah, they don't want too much stuff getting in. They want to keep them, as they put it, on a diet, and they don't want rockets to fly into Israel.
The second one is a kind of important one, isn't it? The final
yeah, it is.
If the Palestinian leadership in Gaza after 2005 had not, from the get-go, decided to use Gaza as a stockpiling place for rockets to fire into Israel, all of it would be different. If they had just resisted the temptation that so many of us do in our lives to stop keeping RPGs in our cellars and then Katyusha rockets in our children's bedrooms, all of it could have been different. If that desire to live in peace beside your neighbors had superseded the desire to stockpile rockets, it would all be different.
Yeah, or if Israel just hadn't occupied them for 60 years, it would all be different too. I mean, why is it the onus always on them?
Well, you believe in self-determination, I'm sure. Yes.
I believe in individual rights, yeah, sure.
Okay, individual rights. And that includes the right to make bad decisions. Yes. The Palestinians in Gaza, when they voted in Hamas, made a very bad decision.
Yeah, of course,
and
Douglas.
in the
but
years,
I think,
hang on,
yes.
hang on. And in the years after that, they made bad decision after bad decision. It was a very bad decision to continually fire thousands of rockets into Israel. It was a very bad decision to use what boats came in early on and to use the smuggling networks from Egypt, not to bring in supplies that you could actually build a thriving society with, but to bring in rockets. It was a very bad idea. No, there was not starvation in Gaza after 2005. No, there was no deficit of goods coming in. I've been plenty of times.
There was no deficit?
No, there are plenty
no goods were kept out.
There are plenty. How many? Have you been to the crossing points?
No.
When were you last there at all?
I've never been.
You've never been?
Well, am I not allowed to talk about it now? I've never been to. Have you ever been to Nazi Germany? Are you allowed to have feelings about them?
You can't time travel, but you can.
Right.
But you can travel.
Okay, but so what? So what's the point? Like,
No,
okay.
I find that
Lots of people have been there and agree with me, and lots of people have been there and agree with you.
Yeah, but
so
if
I don't
you're
know
going
what
to spend a year and a half talking about a place, you should at least do the courtesy of visiting it.
All right. I just think this is a non-argument.
You don't
but
think?
Okay. No, I think it's a non-argument.
But if you're an expert,
But you have to go and touch the ground.
no, I think you have to see. I think it's a good idea to see stuff, particularly if you
Okay.
spend a career talking about something. Yes, I have a journalistic rule of trying never to talk about a country even in passing unless I've at least been there.
Okay.
It's
But
a
that's
sort of
not
normal. It's a normal thing to do. You're talking about. Hang on. You're talking about crossing points, and not only have you never been to a crossing point in either Egypt or in Israel, but you've never even been to the region.
Okay. Again, I think
How
this
can
is a
you-
non-argument.
Hang
I
on,
don't
no,
understand.
No, it's not a non-argument.
Yeah, it is.
It's not a non-argument if you're insisting that you're an expert of some kind, or not claiming you're an expert, but still talking about it, about the provisions going into Gaza or not, if you've never seen any of this going on.
So you're not
That's
allowed to
amazing
speak
to
about
me.
things that you've read about. You can only speak about things that you've seen with your own eyes.
You can talk about what you want,
Uh-huh.
as you're proving. But that is a different matter from spending an awfully long amount of time talking about an issue in a region you haven't even had the courtesy to visit, whilst developing all of these views about it. I mean, now I slightly get an idea of where you're coming from. You've read about this blockade, and so you imagine that that's what it is. I imagine you've read all the people who say that Gaza was a concentration camp, and you probably think that too. Am I right?
I mean, again, literally a concentration camp. It shares a lot of similarities, I would think.
Well, as I say, you can't time travel
Let's
back
go
to the
back to the
Nazi
block-
era.
let's
but
go
you
back to
could
the
go
blockade.
to the Middle
Okay.
East and actually visit it.
Okay,
It's
the
not
World
hard to
World
do.
Bank said in 1996 for the
Now
1
the
year of the
libertarians
blockade.
are quoting the World Bank. I
But
love it.
it doesn't mean anything. This is a non-argument. Yes, I'm saying the World Bank did their own analysis of this, and they said that it was
Why
a
don't
40%
you do your
of
own analysis?
Hold on. You
Jesus
got to
Christ.
stop interrupting
Okay.
and let him finish
I
the
will.
sentence.
The
Fire
World
away.
Bank said that 40% drop in the GDP of 1 year due to the blockade. And there's been a blockade from 2007 on. So are you saying that this hasn't had an economic effect? Is that the argument?
No, of course it'll have an economic effect.
So you're saying
But-
you have to be on the ground and do an audit of the blockade
No.
in order to be able to
I
comment
think
on
you
it?
should at least know what it is, what the territory is, what the situation is in the region. Yes, absolutely.
And the only way
Absolutely.
to do that is to be there in person.
I think that's the best way. It's not the only way, but it's the best way, for sure. For sure. If you have never seen the countries in question, you've never spoken to the people in question, you've never interviewed anyone, you've never gone around, you've never seen the terrain, and so on, and you've used Wikipedia, I'm sorry, no, that's not the same thing.
Okay, well, I've not just used Wikipedia, but didn't you write a big piece when the war in Ukraine first came out, titled something like, I've been to Ukraine and they can win, they can repel the Russians? So you could go there and still get it wrong, right?
No, I was with the Ukrainian armed forces in 2022 when they were retaking territory from the Russians.
Right, the last time they had any advances, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
I said I can see how they could win, which would be advances like that, yeah.
You said if we just fund them, or if we just
No,
arm
I
them,
didn't
that
say
they can then
I said,
they can
I said
repel.
that the Ukrainian army was making great successes, which it was when I was with them in the fall of 22.
Okay, listen, there were lots of people who went to Iraq and said we'll be greeted as liberators and it'll be paid for in oil and democracy will spread through the region. So I don't know, either take on the arguments or don't, but I don't think
I'm saying that your argument's incorrect.
Oh, okay, fine. Well, then present a counter argument to it. But to just tell me I'm not allowed to talk about something because I'm not an expert.
You're not allowed to
okay,
talk
fine. Well,
about
you're not
it.
an expert, so you shouldn't talk about it. You
now.
haven't been there. Yeah, I know. But you keep playing this game where it's like the whole opening to this podcast was like the non-experts talking about this is such a problem. Now you're saying because I haven't been there, I can't talk about it. Is there a blockade there that's causing economic devastation or not? According to the World Bank, there is.
First of all, I don't think it's a game. I don't think it's a game at all.
Me neither.
I'm not playing a game.
Okay, but this is semantics.
No, but this is important. I've seen plenty of this up close. I've seen plenty of this with my own eyes. Because I do believe that one of the things you should do if you're talking about something is to see it.
Yeah, you've established
Okay,
that. Is there a blockade?
Out of Gaza after the first rocket fires when Hamas, in fact before Hamas was elected, the Israelis and the Egyptians didn't do a very good job of it, were meant to be trying to make sure that the materials that went into Gaza were not materials that could be used to build up the Gaza and Hamas war machine. The reason why trucks get searched is not because the Israelis want to search through grain or flour. It's because they wanted to stop the trucks containing the arms and the munitions that the Gazan, Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters were going to use to fire against Israel. And I'm sorry, it just makes the most obvious strategic sense. As the late great Joan Rivers once said, if an appeal to authority.
That one I'll that one I like.
She also said that Michelle Obama's a man.
Yeah, I know she did that.
No, I'm saying she got everything right. So continue. Go ahead.
But as Joan Rivers said, if New York was being rocketed from New Jersey, we would level New Jersey. I don't think you need to level it, by the way. But you would at least try to make sure that rockets weren't being imported in larger quantities into New Jersey.
Of course.
Okay, that's all the Israelis were doing.
And they haven't turned
all
away any
food
or aid. They haven't They haven't said you can't bring potato chips in, or you
give,
can't have cookies because they have dual use.
No,
Isn't this their whole argument that there's anything that could be used to build a rocket has to be excluded?
Anything that could be used to build a rocket. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but that's a good reason. Again, not to build rockets and fire them at your neighbors. It's almost like there's a cost to play. It's almost like there's a cost to pay for, instead of living in peace with your neighbor, constantly trying to wipe them out. And that is what Hamas did for 18 years. 18 years. This is why I think it's so unbelievable taking agency away from the Palestinians of Gaza, is that the Hamas had 18 years, and 18 years is obviously the time from the birth of a child to the end of their formal education. They literally had the opportunity to create a generation in Gaza that wanted to live beside their Israeli neighbors. And from everything I've seen since the 7th of October in the region, and from all of the dead and the survivors and the family members I've seen, so many of them, particularly the people in the south who were attacked on the morning of the 7th, were literally people who dreamed of living in peace with their Palestinian neighbors. They were people like Vivian Silva, whose body wasn't identified for months because there wasn't enough of her charred remains left to even extract DNA from. She spent every weekend, like so many people in the communities in the south of Israel, every weekend driving children with the most rare medical conditions that couldn't be treated in one of the Hamas-run hospitals in Gaza into very specialist units inside Israel. And she spent every weekend doing that and working with B'Tselem and all of these radical left Israeli groups. And it didn't matter a bit when Hamas came in because they burnt her in her own home anyway. My point is, in all of the counterfactuals of this conflict, the most important one is what could have happened if instead of educating a generation into wanting to annihilate their neighbors, Hamas in power had spent 18 years building up a state, teaching peace, creating coexistence with their neighbors. You think any of the people on the kibbutzim in the south or the young people dancing at the Nova party weren't dreaming of the day that the Palestinian government in Gaza would have created those conditions for them to live beside as well. Of course.
That's
Right.
anybody's argument.
Yeah, no, right.
Everybody argues against
nobody's
it.
arguing. Douglas, it's just,
No,
again,
I mean
it's,
here.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's not what I'm saying. Look, I'll say this again, because you bring up the point about agency again. And I hear this a lot as a counter. Much like I said in Ukraine, it's not denying anybody agency. I'm not saying that. Believe me, if I was in control of how people acted, I would certainly. Palestinians could have handled things much better, and there are different points where we probably all would agree that we wish they had done it this way and not this way. And I think that embracing, for those Palestinians who embrace terrorism, which pretty early on, I mean, Israel and Palestine have been at war since the existence of Israel, really. And I know it's convenient to kind of pretend October 7th was like the first thing, but actually there's a long history here. I'm not denying any of them agency. The problem is that I see it as like you only seem to focus on the agency of one side. And then, if you want to talk about counterfactuals, I think the most interesting counterfactual, well, maybe I'll give you two. Number one, would be Chaim Weizmann, who was essentially supposed to be the David Ben-Gurion, like he was in line as like the number one ranking Zionist. This is pre the creation of the State of Israel, who urged all of the Zionist militias to not embrace terrorism. And he ended up losing that battle ultimately. In many ways, this is how terrorism was introduced.
He was the first president of the state.
David Ben-Gurion was. I said Chaim Weizmann. Yes. And he basically ended up losing his position to David Ben-Gurion because they just wanted to be more hardcore. And by the way, the Ergon and the Lehigh and the Haganah, they openly embraced terrorism to drive out an occupying force. This is literally the story of the creation of the State of Israel. The Palestinians fell into a terrible, tragic mistake early on. And I'm saying, listen, I reject terrorism as we all should, just because killing innocent people is wrong. I'd like to get to that a little bit more in a second, because it's interesting that we haven't really gotten into what I think is a great humanitarian crisis here. But they were following, I think in some ways they were very influenced by the Algerian model, that they were like, hey, look, we could listen, there's a lot of groups, whether it's...
Which Algerian model?
Well, driving the French out. Right,
So the first Algerian.
Yes, but look, I mean, there's a lot of these scenarios where the tragic mistake in terms of political outcome from the Palestinians is that they really just underestimated the fact that these Jews had no home to go to. This was their home. And you could drive out the French from Algeria because they go, screw it, we're going back home to France. The Jews had been so persecuted in Eastern Europe that there was no home to go back. And of course, then after World War II, they were here to stay. And so of course it's been a tragedy. And of course, a lot of Palestinian actions I wish would be different. I wish Hamas didn't exist. It should be pointed out, by the way, that in 2005, you did mention that it was really part of the Bush administration's exporting democracy around the world that put pressure on them to have these elections. It should also be mentioned that Hamas did not win a majority in one single precinct. They won pluralities all around. So just saying, when we're bringing up this election, half the population of Gaza today is under the age of 18. They were toddlers if they were alive in 2005. Of the other half, that maybe half of them voted in these elections, it was never a majority that supported Hamas. They eked out a victory. And then, of course, there was an attempted coup after that, and that's when Hamas seized complete control. The coup failed. Regardless of any of that, I agree with you that, the Palestinians have agency, and I wish some of them had made better decisions. Now, many of them have made better decisions, and it's still resulted in nothing better happening for them and their people. And so I do find it kind of hard to, lecture a group of people who are going through so much. The level of human suffering that's being inflicted on the people of Gaza right now cannot be overstated. And so, to lecture them about how you're supposed to handle that exactly. But I will say, man, I think there's kind of this selective empathy that you have here. I agree with you, talk about these teenagers being slaughtered at a music festival on October 7th. It's like, my God, I have little kids. I can't imagine the nightmare of this happening to somebody's children. But at the same time, we're not having this conversation on October 9th or in November or December of 2023. We're having it in 2025, where the tragedy that's been inflicted on Gaza is orders of magnitudes greater than October 7th. There are just every day people are inundated with images of just dead women and children. This is like one of the most brutal wars, and by several metrics that really, like personally matter to me, like the number of dead kids. I think that's a pretty good one. It's more children have died than in any recent war. I mean, this is like, it does these debates, and I've had several of them, as you have also. But it seems to me that there's almost an implicit difference in the value that you place on Israeli life versus the value that we place on Palestinians' life. And to even, we've gone this far into the conversation, I haven't even talked about the fact that, Israel has... If you want to argue, I haven't been there, stuff does get through the blockade, okay, fine. This is a captive people, that Israel has dominated since at least 1967. Many of them are there because of the creation of the State of Israel, who used to live in what is now called Israel. And they are just, the amount of human suffering that's being inflicted on them, when, even as you kind of acknowledged with the George W. Bush exporting democracy, Hamas in many ways was forced on these people. In fact, we saw protests against Hamas just recently. So, I don't know. That to me seems to be the greatest human tragedy, and I think much more so than you can characterize it as people being pro-Hamas or people being anti-Semitic, but I actually think that the mass movement around the world of people who oppose this war has been that people feel really awful about all these babies and who are being slaughtered.
Okay, quite a few things. First of all, let's just get the term correct, because you said you do think it's a concentration camp.
I said it shares many.
And you also say that there's disproportionately heavier youth population in Gaza.
Yes. Do you think that's not accurate?
I think the second one is accurate.
Right.
But it's a very strange thing to say that there's a population with a concentration camp. In Auschwitz in the 1940s, there was a reduction in population.
No, I didn't say it was.
He didn't say
it
it's a concentration camp. He said it shares many characteristics.
Auschwitz was a concentration camp.
There was
They
ultimately a
did
death
not
camp,
have,
no?
it started as a concentration
Yes,
camp.
correct.
You'll notice that people were not doubling in size their number because of the children they could have in Auschwitz.
Yeah, but nobody's
So,
nobody's
hang on.
calling it a
You
concentration
can't-
camp because it's the
You're
same
saying,
as Auschwitz.
okay,
I don't
but
know.
let's just at least tidy up the language of that. Either you think the place is a concentration camp, or you think it's not a concentration camp, and I don't think it can be a concentration camp, or any such term is suitable. When you're talking about a place which you yourself have admitted saying.
But you asked him if it did. You
Yes.
asked him if it had any characteristics of a concentration.
Yes, because he said earlier that it did.
Okay, well, all
Long
I'm saying,
before
okay,
that.
so let me
That
be
speaks fair.
much
Long
more
before
precise.
that.
Let me be much more precise, okay? So I'm not claiming that it is a concentration camp or that it is akin to Auschwitz. I'm saying that it's been under full blockade since 2007. Israel rules the seas, the airs, they control electricity that goes in. They're not allowed to have an airport, they're not allowed to have a seaport. They don't have the freedom to leave without permission from the Israeli government. They don't have the freedom to trade with the world. They don't have a freedom to vote over the government that rules them. I don't know. Call it whatever you want to. That's the situation. For one of the babies that have died of the bombs that they're dropping.
Let's get onto that, because you say it's one of the most brutal. It's a very brutal. It's certainly not even, sadly, by London standards of our time, by any means of the most brutal. We don't need to get into the rather statistician, ugly debate about whether or not we follow Hamas government Gaza's figures from death camps, which most of the world's media rely on, which I don't think are to the least extent. But you don't need to rely on that to say that, even by the standards of the conflict in neighbouring Syria, the highest Hamas death count inside Gaza for the whole last year is less than an average year has been for the last decade in Syria during the civil war. So
The whole deck. I mean, total far more people died in Syria. I'm not arguing that, but you're saying it's less than any year. I think there were years that were pretty.
600,000 to 800,000 people have been killed in Syria, and I give it as an example. Far too many examples in the region, wider world to go to, but I think we get once again back to the issue of language. One of the most brutal wars. It's simply obvious that it's an appalling war, but it is not by any numerical or other standards the most appalling war party. It's the war that Hamas started. So they shouldn't have invaded that neighborhood. They shouldn't have tried to genocide that neighborhood. Now, if the war can be prosecuted, could be prosecuted, it was always for two reasons. Always for two reasons. The first one, as stated by the unanimity of Israeli politicians and others, was to retrieve the hostages. We also haven't spoken about that there are still hostages in Gaza, held for the last 18 months by Hamas, including young Eden Alexander from Chelsea. If Hamas had not stolen the hostages and hidden them in their tunnels and hidden them in civilian homes, this war would have over. If they had given them back, tomorrow, it would all be different. But they didn't. They decided to do what they did on the 7th, to hold on to the 250 odd hostages as it was at the beginning from them. The second reason why the war is still being prosecuted is because of the stated aim to destroy Hamas, which is the stated aim of the Israelis. Neither of these things is remotely easy. Okay? And just from a point of humility, I think, on everyone's side, which you can see, none of that is easy. It is not easy to get 250 hostages back when they have been distributed across the Gaza to civilian homes, hidden in tunnels, surrounded by munitions and much more. Hamas is not an actor like Denmark. Its backers don't behave the way that our governments do in the West. They have a totally different time scale that they think along. They have a totally different scale of values as well. The taunts of Hezbollah's leadership, of Hamas's leadership, of their backers in Tehran, are annihilationist to their core. But at any point in the last 18 months, the Qataris, for instance, or the Iranians, the Iranian Revolutionary Government, or the Turkish government or others, could have put their pressure on Hamas to return the hostages who are still being held in captivity, and everything would be different. Secondly, as you know, I'm sure, you don't have to have seen this with your own eyes to know, as I'm sure you know, the way in which Hamas built up the structure of the Gaza throughout the 18 years that they had was precisely to flout and use every law of war against the Israelis. Every army in a conflict has certain rules of war that you're meant to abide by. One of the most obvious is that you are identified as being a combatant, not as a civilian. Okay?
Humility in these complex situations. But I would also say, like, do you not then at any point, as you're like a very well-known public figure who's supporting this war, think about the level of human suffering that is being inflicted on these innocent people and go like, man, is there another way? Maybe I'm getting this wrong. Maybe this is the Iraq war all over again, you know, which you also supported, that like maybe that was a big mistake.
If I say it, I don't need to think about it. I've seen it.
Okay,
I
fine.
know
Okay.
it. I describe it in my book.
Okay.
I describe what I see in Gaza with the Palestinians when they're moving down the humanitarian corridor.
Okay, let me just respond to some of the stuff you're saying. Okay, so then I guess it's not really that much of humility involved in this, but there's two very different goals that are being stated here, right? Like there's the retrieving the hostages, and then there's taking out Hamas. Now, the retrieving the hostages, and actually many of the families of hostages who are taken have been some of the only people really protesting this war in Israel, because of course, you know, if you imagine, if you have your family over there and your government is leveling this place, that is not the best path to pursue to make sure you get all the hostages out alive. I would say that it fell apart, but Donald Trump having his envoy Witkoff go over there and work out this ceasefire deal that they had for a few weeks. They did get, I believe, 30 hostages back during the phase 1 of this ceasefire. Seems to me like that would be the method to pursue to try to get the hostages back. But if you're talking about eliminating Hamas, I think there's something kind of interesting that you touched on there. I don't I disagree with much of your characterization of it, that like Israel are the good guys who always follow the rules. We could kind of get into some of that. There's lots of rules like in that Israel does not follow. That being said, yes, of course. I mean, you're describing guerrilla warfare, terrorist organizations. That's right. It's stated differently. Gaza doesn't have an air force or an army or a navy. They're just basically militias running around. The idea that it's not like, I don't think, morally speaking, when you're inflicting this level of suffering on a group of people, that the calculation should be like, well, we want to remove Hamas from power. That's the goal. Justice for October 7th. There's lots of governments around the world that we would, and Hamas isn't exactly a government, but there's lots of regimes around the world that we would all like to see removed, but that doesn't mean that we would approve of any means by which to get there. If you were like, hey, I think Kim Jong-un, but there's lots of regimes around the world that we would all like to see removed, but that doesn't mean that we would approve of any means by which to get there. If you were like, hey, I think Kim Jong-un's government should be dissolved, I'm sure we would all agree with that. But if you were like, I'm going to level the place and just like slaughter people in order to do it, you might be like, okay, hold on. But aside from that, this has been acknowledged at and U.S. intelligence, that there's just no way to get rid of Hamas without it being replaced by more Hamas or Hamas-like group, because it's the basic understanding of this whole situation, right? It's General McChrystal's insurgent math.
Hey, Gandalf, you still there?
Hamas are popping back up in the areas that Israel's already leveled. And the more innocent people you kill, the more radicalized you're going to get this population, the more these people are going to hate you and join up with the resistance movement. And so I just think that to use the justification that we're trying to get rid of Hamas, and therefore it's not like, it doesn't matter how many innocent women and children die in the process, or there's no responsibility on you. You now are not responsible for the bombs that you drop, how many people they kill.
No, of course you're responsible.
So Israel's responsible then?
They're responsible for the means of their retaliation and their war aims. Yes, of course. But
Okay.
First of all, let me just say, I totally disagree with your characterization of Osama bin Laden and what he wanted to do, and I don't think that Osama bin Laden's stated public utterances along those lines. But anyway, the reason why the hostages have been released, the numbers that have, is because of constant kinetic force by the IDF. Hamas does not come to the table and ever hand over hostages out of goodwill. It doesn't do it.
No argument there.
Of their own heart. It does it because of the constant kinetic force of the IDF in Gaza. And if it weren't for that, all 250 hostages would still be there. Second thing is, when it comes to Hamas itself, I totally disagree with the presumption that if you tackle a terrorist entity, you will create more terrorists. Ergo, you should not attack a terrorist entity.
That's not the argument that I'm making, but okay.
It's a commonly held argument that if you respond to terrorism, you create terrorism. And of course, the only thing in that case is you just have to sit back and
The argument that I'm making is that when you slaughter innocent people...
Yes, horrible, the war in Gaza. It's horrible that young Israelis have to go in, yet again, to Gaza and try to find Israeli hostages and try to get the leadership of Hamas.
That's what's horrible about it?
It is not the case. Yes, because I think there's a consequence to starting wars.
But so it's not horrible for the people who didn't start a war? Why do we become like these collectivists as soon as a war starts?
For everybody involved.
No, it's the most horrible for the Palestinian people in Gaza right now. That is the group of people who are being fucked over the most right now. No?
Yes, at the moment, yes.
Right.
But they're not being fucked over. The IDF has been moving through Gaza for 18 months. No Israeli soldier I have spoken to ever wanted to go and see the Gaza again. Okay? Nobody wanted to go back. They were dragged back because of Hamas's actions. And if Hamas had acted differently, or the Palestinians had voted in different people into govern them, it would all be different. But again, that's a hypothetical. The reality of the war on the ground is that in this incredibly heavily built up area, with weaponry hidden everywhere, with soldiers, I've spoken to too many of them, they go in, you have a group of people coming out of a civilian building with their hands up, and from their midst come a bunch of Hamas terrorists firing at you, in the hope that the IDF will fire back at the civilians. Gadi Eisenkot, one of the members of the war cabinet in the early stages of the war, lost his own son and then his nephew. His nephew was killed in a firefight in Gaza because the Hamas terrorists were firing from a mosque, and that was why Gadi Eisenkopf is hideous because of what Hamas has done to the Gaza. The reason why Sinwar cropped up in Rafah, finally, the mastermind of October 7th, one of the most brutal, sadistic psychopaths late last year, is because there was nowhere else for him to run because of the actions of the IDF to pursue the leadership of Hamas that was responsible for the south. Now, can all of Hamas be destroyed? Probably not. Can you make it effectively impossible to function, or incapable of functioning, unable to fire rockets and govern the Gaza? Yes.
Right, but it comes at the price tag of slaughtering tens of thousands of innocent people.
No.
And you're accepting that price?
No. And every single war of this kind will include civilian casualties, and you and I will almost certainly disagree on the numbers.
I'm not claiming that the health ministry's numbers are perfect.
But there will be almost the best case analysis is that one innocent Gazan has been killed for every one terrorist. That's the best case scenario you can hear. But that would be almost unparalleled in the laws of war, and it's not how the American or British militaries operate in terms of casualties to terrorist ratios. But when we had the campaign against ISIS a decade ago, after ISIS's fighters had gone and massacred people at the Bataclan Theatre in Paris and so on, we used Turkish fighters, brilliant, brave fighters from the Peshmerga militias, to work on the ground. And the French and American and British air forces bombed like hell from the air. And we made ISIS, effectively, touch wood, 10 years later, operationally incapable in capital cities in Europe. Has ISIS as a whole gone away? No. They still have pockets in Syria and in Iraq. But we stopped them from being able to do what they most desired to do. And the same is possible with Hamas. Will they be replaced by some other group? Again, then we get to one of the crucial decision points for the Palestinian people. Is it inevitable that they constantly have to elect people who want to annihilate their neighbors? Or will there ever be a generation that can find a way to live in peace with their neighbors? I agree. Most people don't like being bombed. In fact, nobody does. But if the people of the Palestinians in Gaza can find it within themselves to realize the thing they asked for in the elections is the thing that has destroyed the area they live in, and like that brave young man 2 weeks ago in Gaza who rose up against Hamas and was identified by the people who remain in Hamas and was tortured and his body thrown onto his parents' doorstep in the Gaza. Parents started the clan started a bit of a war against Hamas, but that's how Hamas treats Palestinian dissidents. But if there were more people like that young man, and of course you'll know that the history of totalitarian and terrorist groups running societies is they're very successful and they stay in power because they're willing to torture and use violence and much more. That it's a horrible thing you have to contend with. But if more people like that young man had come about in Gaza in the last 18 months or before, yes, it would all be different. And if they could avoid electing a terrorist group that invades their neighbors and fires rockets at their neighbors, yes, it could all be different. It could all be different tomorrow. And I'll tell you, sorry, again, there is not a per day that such a generation of Palestinians emerges.
Yeah. I think that okay, I have a few things here. On Syria there, because it is true. I mean, I think so. Okay, so John Brennan and Barack Obama, the head of the CIA and of course the former president of the United States of America, had a policy of committing literal treason before they ended up accusing Donald Trump of treason, which was all bullshit. But they had a policy of committing literal treason by funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the Syrian civil war, poured billions of dollars and tons of weapons into that conflict. When Donald Trump, now it is true, by the way, that you are correct that like there certainly were military actions taken against ISIS after they invaded Iraq, which was not supposed to be part of the plan. There was also a lot of military actions taken by Vladimir Putin against ISIS after he came in on Assad's request, as you know. In 2017, when Donald Trump came in, one of the best things Donald Trump ever did, he cut off the CIA program to fund the anti-Assad rebels. And this was also a big part of what ended up like taking the, the energy out of ISIS. Also, I think there was a lot of good reporting that just they turned enough people on the ground against them. They were even just too radical, and just people ended up hating them. It is true that they receded for quite a while, although the former emir of Al-Qaeda, al-Jilani, is now ruling Syria, which does not seem like a great deal or something that people in America should support. The true enemy of the American people, Al-Qaeda, now being in charge of Syria. I think that, it's easy to talk about how, like, if the Palestinians had done this different, then maybe things would have worked out different. But I just think, again, when you look at things, when you say, which essentially I think is your point here, right? Which, I mean, I tried to push you on this, but you're saying, look, we can degrade Hamas, but the cost of that is going to be slaughtering a whole bunch of people.
Not slaughtering, it's war.
Okay, I think you're... okay, they're not being slaughtered. They're being killed. Okay, whatever word you want to use. They're being killed
in a brutal war started by Hamas. Yes.
Yes, it's babies and little kids screaming out for help under rubble, and no help is coming. They sit there under the rubble until they die. That is the level of human suffering that's being inflicted. And if you want to say, well, listen, that's a price that I'm willing to pay to try to degrade Hamas, even though you yourself recognize that we can't totally eliminate them, but we could maybe degrade them or maybe take them down a peg. No. And the price for that is these babies being tortured to death, essentially, whatever you want to call it. Okay. But from the other side of that story, like, if there's, like, I got little kids, I don't know if you have kids, I know you have kids, Joe. If anybody ever was saying to me that, like, my kids were the acceptable price for this policy that we want to put into place, I'm saying I don't think there's any scenario, Douglas, where there would be any time where you would accept Israeli kids dying like that as an acceptable price for a policy that you're going to be advocating for.
First of all, again, going back to what is actually happening. There is no desire or aim by the IAF or the IDF to go into Gaza and kill women and children.
But they're doing it, though.
Hang on. There is no desire for that. Does it happen collaterally? Certainly. And that is one of the very ugly rules of war, and things that happens in war, and it's another of the reasons why almost like you shouldn't start a war and hide your rockets and your terrorists inside civilian buildings.
Yeah, but hang on. You've made this point a lot of times, but okay.
Well, it clearly can't be made enough, because there is no intention on the Israeli side to cause the death of non-combatants.
Oh, come on. I mean,
hang on.
Listen.
What? You think? Why do you think the Israelis would want to go and kill children in Gaza?
Listen, let me just, how about I say it like this, okay? And by the way, when I say it like this, I'm not claiming that disputes between nations are the same as handling dispute domestically. I'm just saying on the idea of intentionality or who wants to do this or whatever. Look, even if you had the right, let's say somebody broke onto your property and killed some of your family members and you want to go kill this guy. If he goes back to his apartment building and you know that there's women and children in that apartment building, and so your move is to blow up the building, what you would be charged with is murder in the first degree. Cold-blooded, premeditated, intentional murder. And you could sit there and tell the judge, I didn't want to kill all those people. Why would I want to kill all of those people? I just had to kill that one guy. But that's bullshit. That's not what counts. You did it intentionally. You dropped a bomb knowing that there were women and children in that building. You're taking an action knowing that these innocent people are going to die. Then that is by definition intentional. And, you could sit here and talk about, and it is true, there have been documented cases of Hamas placing missiles in mosques and in schools and things like that. But when you look at the aerial footage of Gaza, that does not describe every single strike that Israel has launched. There have been tons of bombs dropped where it's simply, and we have very good reporting on this, where they've literally just have information that they believe with some degree of certainty that a couple of Hamas militants are in this building, and so they blow up the building. That is intentionally murdering innocent people. And if you're going to advocate for this war, I don't see how you can do it without saying that, like, at least bite the bullet that Madeleine Albright did when she was asked, we've played this clip on the show before, when she's point blank asked about the sanctions on Iraq, and are 500,000 children, is that price acceptable? And she said, yes, we believe that price is acceptable. You're saying if you're going to support this war, you know this is the price of it, so why can't you just say, yes, that price is acceptable? Because then we could have a real conversation about why the other side is going to look at you like a monster.
Because, first of all, I don't agree with any of the characterization you make. Any of it.
Okay.
ADF trying to clear an area which has been very carefully and well booby trapped for years. Let me make one other very quick point about the bigger picture that you said, because I think it's important. We were talking about the Syrian, you mentioned the Syrian conflict and ISIS. I think, again, it's really important to keep this in mind, what I said earlier about let's not think we are the primary actors everywhere, or even that important. I remember the debate over the Syrian intervention issue. And at the time, despite being in many cases an interventionist, I said on that occasion, we didn't know what we were doing, clearly didn't know who we were going to back. Went to Syria to speak to some rebels, and one of them turned out to be a kind of head hacker jihadist. Yep. That wasn't great. I said I don't have any confidence that we know who to back. And despite many Syrian friends of mine imploring me otherwise, I said I don't think it's something we can get involved in. However, if you look at the last 10 years or more, now 13 years of conflict in Syria, the US